The city morning felt like a metronome gone loud. Raindrops tapping a restless rhythm against the windshield, against the umbrella canopy, against Hannah Mitchell's patience. She checked the time again, as if the number might change if she stared hard enough. 7:38. Her meeting was at 8:30. Tyler's inhaler sat in the cereal box because that was where he'd left it last night. Mrs. Patel had texted at 7, "Stuck on 3rd, traffic, be there in 10." Hannah slid a slice of toast between her cheeks, tightened her jacket, and looped Tyler's backpack over his small shoulder, practicing calm like a separating ritual. Tyler looked up at her with solemn 10-year-old eyes. He was already half a beat older each morning, more bandaged with responsibility than his years should allow. He clutched his school permission slip like currency. "Do you have the note about the parent-teacher meeting?" "You put it in your folder," Hannah said, voice gentler than she felt. She kissed his forehead, the brief, private ritual that steadied them both. He smiled, a boy's smile that tried to make everything less heavy. Outside, the street smelled like wet asphalt and the city's impatient breath. Hannah jogged to the bus stop, the strap of her tote slipping against her shoulder. Her heels clicked in a counterpoint to the rain. She could picture the conference room, whiteboard, projected slides, 10 senior staff waiting for the update she'd spent 3 nights polishing. The budget cuts meant the meeting was everything. If she botched this, Richard Morrow, her supervisor, would write the memo that became more than words, a judgment on her value. She almost missed it. A delivery bike, rubber tires hissing on the slick road, skidded, then a man in a navy coat staggered and went down like a marionette with strings cut. Briefcase exploded across the gutter, papers smoked in the rain like birds fleeing a nest. For a second, the city reduced to that small violence. The man's breath shallow, a sprawl of leather and paper, and the metallic smell of blood. "Excuse me," Hannah said before she had a plan, because some part of her still belonged to reflex. The moment was luminous, like an exposed nerve. A crowd gathered in flurries, sympathetic, curious, and then the practical part of Hannah's mind kicked in. The meeting. Tick. She stood on the edge of whatever decision would define her day. She chose the man. There was no glamour in the choice. There was only a person who needed help and a mother who had taught her son to put kindness where it belonged. She bent, checked his pulse, felt the cool wet of rain through her sleeve. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. Familiar, brown, but not with the focused authority she'd later hear of in headlines. He was disoriented, clutching his calf. "I'll," someone said. "No," he murmured, squinting as if the light hurt. "I don't—" "Listen to me," Hannah said, voice sharpened by the small, fierce calm of necessity. "You need an ambulance. I can wait with you." She packeted her scarf around his hand, found his jacket collar, pressed a thermal packet against his ankle. The delivery rider, pale and apologetic, kept saying he was sorry. Minutes piled in the rain. An ambulance arrived, lights bright and almost hurtful in the gray. The EMTs moved with rehearsed certainty. The man's ankle would later be called a compound fracture, the kind of phrase that made law and caution lean forward. But in that pool of emergency fluorescent light and rain, the practical question was who would watch his briefcase? Who would hold his soaked folder of papers? Hannah sat on the curb with his umbrella over them both, because the world seemed to insist on small mercies. She missed the bus. She missed the meeting. By the time Hannah stumbled into the lobby of the office building, hair plastered, breath caught, she was 27 minutes late. The front desk receptionist gave her a quick, apologetic smile. The conference room door was closed. The stairwell smelled like coffee. Hannah's phone buzzed with one message that felt heavier than any other. "Richard, where are you?" That exchange happened fast, businesslike. Richard's voice, when finally she heard it, had the thin sheen of someone who judged by metrics rather than context. "You know our policy on punctuality, Hannah," he said. "We're under scrutiny this quarter. There's no leeway." "I stopped to help someone who'd been hit by a bike," she said, words urgent and sincere. "He was hurt, broken ankle. I stayed for the ambulance. There were papers, a briefcase. I held his umbrella." There was a pause that was itself a verdict. "Your compassion is admirable, but this isn't the first time, and the companies had to be prepared for absences. I can't excuse repeat tardiness." She tried to marshal the details, how the man had refused initially, how refuses can be fragile. She tried to make him see the calculus differently. "There has to be someone." "HR has been explicit, Hannah." Richard's voice clipped like a shears. "I have to mark this as a final. You'll receive paperwork." There was no melodrama to his cruelty, only policy executed with the kind of mechanized civility that left people in tatters. He signed forms, typed phrases that would follow her like a shadow. Hannah listened to the words that named her unemployment. Her throat felt raw, as if the rain had washed more than water. She left with a box. The office watched her with that particular cold curiosity reserved for payments rendered in human terms. Diane tried to hand her a sympathy note. "I'm so sorry, Hannah," she said, eyes kind but helpless. "I'll cover those files if they need someone." She stepped out into the rain, and it felt suddenly shrunken, the city smaller, the sounds muffled by the weight of what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with a string of small emergencies. Tyler's school needing a permission slip signed. Mrs. Patel saying she could come by but was late. A pharmacy texting about a prescription. The world rearranged itself around a new, immediate math. Bills, inhalers, rent, the cost of a small, ordinary life. On the bus, Hannah's fingers absently smoothed the papers from the injured man's briefcase that she'd kept safe. Loyalty to a stranger folded into the same hands that had filled out contract forms for 3 years. She'd no reason to open them, only an attachment that felt stubborn. But when the folded letter caught between 2 receipts showed a logo she recognized from the building's lobby, Vertex Innovations, her heart knocked against its cage. An unfamiliar name printed on a business card read, "Benjamin Crawford, Chief Executive." For a second she felt strange, an intruder in her own narrative. Fortune, in stories, often wore a suit. In life, it usually wore paperwork and signatures and HR disclaimers. This was a strange collision. The man for whom she'd cared, the one whose ankle had snapped like a weak branch, was connected to the very place where she'd been dismissed. The bus carried her home, the world blanketed in rain and thought. Tyler met her at the door, eyes wide and anxious. "Are you okay?" he asked, fumbling with the inhaler box like a talisman. She made dinner with 2 hands that felt heavier than before, and the conversation in the small kitchen orbited around logistics. How long would benefits last? How would they buy the inhaler refill? How would she tell their landlord? Night compressed small things, dinner, dishes, the ritual for asthma that felt like a careful liturgy. Tyler's homework lay open, a volcano project due Friday, a picture of the solar system with glitter glued on crooked. He asked Hannah, without malice, what would happen if she couldn't go to work anymore. "We'd figure it out," she said. Her voice carried the script of reassurance, belief before evidence. She tucked him into bed, smoothed his hair, listened to the quick rise and fall of his breath, and felt the unnameable fear of being the person who couldn't provide. Sleep arrived as it always did, in small, distracted fragments. The city rain beat on the window like a slow, pressing question. She dreamed of briefcases and conference rooms and the man on the curb, and the dream turned sometimes into a ledger, bills on one side, kindness on the other. Which weighed more? Morning light found her at the kitchen table, documents spread before her. Termination letter, a list of emergency numbers, a spreadsheet she'd made to try to make sense of the next 6 months. She called Mrs. Patel, who came with her practical, measured kindness and a bag of groceries, as if physical things could write the math. "We'll get through this," Mrs. Patel said. Her voice was a warm cloth. "One thing at a time." Tyler's inhaler. Keep the refills. I have some saved from a surplus. You come over if you need a place to stay for a night. We are neighbors. Neighbors were the small scaffolding of survival. Hannah accepted the bag and the offer with gratitude that tasted like relief and shame braided together. Then the phone rang. It was an unknown number at first. Her thumb hovered before she answered, the way one might stand on the edge of an old wound. The voice that came through was crisp, carefully neutral. "Is this Hannah Mitchell?" "Yes," she said, the single syllable a red flag and a key. "My name is Patricia Winters. I'm Benjamin Crawford's executive assistant. Mr. Crawford asked me to call you. We would like to speak with you about the incident yesterday. Could you come to Vertex this afternoon? He asked that you meet him in his office." The room blurred into a smear of refrigerator magnets and unpaid invoices. For a moment, she was a child in line at the principal's office, feeling both dread and dignity. He wants to see me? I don't understand." "We only have a small window," Patricia said. 10 o'clock. Can you make it?" Hannah glanced at the termination letter again, then at Tyler's photo tacked to the bulletin board above the kitchen phone. Her hands were steady, though her heart was a small, frantic thing. "I can be there," she said. She told Mrs. Patel what had happened, and then found herself moving in a rhythm that was part disbelief and part resolve. She buttoned her coat, smoothed the crease from an old blouse that would have to be respectable enough, and went outside into the rain that had been her punctuation for the last 2 days. The cab ride to the Vertex Tower felt like a lengthening of the very thing that had felled her: the city, the rain, the minutes that might turn a life. Her head replayed the phrase, Benjamin Crawford, like a name card she wasn't allowed to touch. Inside the lobby, the glass swallowed sound. The building hummed with a different currency: air-conditioned certainty, valet slippers, the brisk movements of people wearing invisible titles. Hannah's hands clutched the damp strap of her tote. On the elevator ride up, she watched herself in the mirrored panel. The woman who'd been steady enough to hold an umbrella over a stranger, now feeling something like a private exposure. The security desk asked a few questions, took her name, and then sent her forward. Patricia's assistant ushered her along a corridor where the carpet softened footsteps and the art softened nerves. The air smelled faintly of citrus. The office floors had a clean order that felt like a system designed to avoid surprises. When Patricia appeared, she was all polish and efficiency, hair arranged to suggest no strand had ever gone out of place, a cardigan like armor. There was nothing theatrical about her. She offered a small, professional smile that did not pry. "Thank you for coming," Patricia said. "Mr. Crawford will be down in a moment. In the meantime, do you need water? Coffee?" Hannah shook her head. She sat and tried to breathe in a rhythm that would not betray the way the world had rebalanced itself on the pivot of a phone call. She thought of Tyler at home, the inhaler hidden in the cereal cupboard like a tiny, vital secret. She thought of Richard's hands, closing a door with the precision of someone who thought policy more sacred than people. She thought of the man in the rain, and how small her kindness had felt, and how large it might yet become. She had not been in an executive suite before, not like this. The waiting area was modern, not ostentatious. Bookshelves with generous, glossy volumes, a low coffee table with a neat stack of magazines. Hannah noticed the care taken in the placement of things. Even the plants were trimmed with corporate confidence. When Ben Crawford entered, the first impression was not of wealth, but of presence. He moved carefully, like someone used to coordinating large problems. One ankle was in a brace, his suit slightly rumpled from the accident. He offered a hand with cautious steadiness. "Hannah Mitchell," he said. "Thank you for staying with me yesterday." His voice was neither theatrical nor patronizing. It was grateful, plain. Hannah's defenses, a mixture of wariness and exhaustion, shifted in a small, human way. "You shouldn't have been late for work because of me," he said. His eyes carried something like apology and curiosity. "I heard you were dismissed." That sentence landed with a kind of quiet thunder. She had rehearsed answers at home that sounded like dignified acceptance. Now her throat constricted not from shame, but from the sudden, sharp need to be heard. "I was doing what felt right," she said. The simplicity of that line surprised both of them. It wasn't a choice to be late, it was a responsibility. Ben listened with attention. There was something in his posture that suggested he was not merely collecting facts. He seemed to be sorting them into a shape that might matter later. Patricia sat near, an attentive shape in neutral tones, making notes with a discreet professionalism that had no malice. "We took the liberty of reviewing the situation," Patricia said after a moment. "Mr. Crawford wanted to be sure that what happened was understood in context." Ben's voice softened. "I'm sorry Richard was so blunt." The mention of Richard Morrow brought the memory like a fresh bruise. "He has to enforce rules," Hannah said. "It's how he keeps his control." Ben's expression flickered. "Rules are important," he agreed, "but context matters too. Hannah, would you consider telling me more about your situation? Not for sympathy, for understanding." It was a strange, precarious window. Hannah felt like a person caught between two worlds, the sterile certainty of corporate policy and the messy human world that refused tidy answers. She spoke about Tyler, about the inhaler, about Mrs. Patel, about the rent due and the spreadsheet she'd made that morning that had columns for rent, medicine, and miscellaneous. She spoke about the small humiliations, the feeling of being surveyed by colleagues as they signaled their approval or disapproval through invisible channels. Ben listened with an attention that felt like currency. When she finished, he reached to the side and placed a small envelope on his knee, the sort of small, decisive gesture that meant he intended to act rather than simply observe. Hannah did not open it. She felt, for the first time in a long time, seen. "You did what most would not," he said. "You stopped. You stayed. That matters." There, in his succinct sentence, was a validation she needed and did not know she craved. But then came the practicalities, because even acts of grace in the corporate world must travel through procedures. Patricia made a notation about HR policies, about how any action on behalf of the company would require review, legal consultation, and board notification. Her professionalism kept the scene from sliding into surreality. "We can't undo what Richard did retroactively without a process," she said. "But we can open an investigation. Full disclosure, Mr. Crawford, there will be implications. There will be HR protocols." Ben nodded. "I understand. But we can't let a rule be an excuse for inflexibility when lives are affected." Hannah, who had been primed all morning for defensiveness, found herself nodding instead at the insistence on due process. In a different life, she might have been cynical, jealous even, of such a way of doing things. Here it felt like a lifeline. Time, not charity. Time to ensure the steps would be proper, transparent. "You should go home," Ben said softly. "Take the day. We'll have someone from HR be in touch." The day bled into a strange kind of vertigo. Hannah walked out of the Vertex Tower with a mixture of relief and wary wonder. She had not been rehired. No generous check was tucked in her pocket. She had only been granted something that here felt almost dangerous, attention from a powerful man who had more than a reputation. The stairs and elevators of the city were full of people with their own anonymous tragedies. Hers felt, for a moment, like it had been acknowledged. She went home in a cab that moved slowly, as if hesitant to hurry her back to small certainties. Tyler ran to greet her, eyes wide, inventive questions spilling from him. "Did you see him? The man? Did he have a cool cast?" Hannah laughed. Actual lightness, a small, alarming wealth. "He'll have a brace," she said, "and a story." That night she fell asleep with a mixture of hope and fear. The spreadsheet on a kitchen table still demanded answers. There would be calls from HR, she knew. There would be the inevitable bureaucratic labyrinth that followed any corporate engagement. There would also be Richard's memo, already circulating like a slow-setting frost. She had little illusions about how the world tilted. Sometimes the person with the loudest title could be wrong, and sometimes the people like her had to buy their stability back with patience and negotiation. 2 mornings later, as she was filling out a new job application, one that did not mention the neat ghost of unceremonious dismissal, her phone rang. The screen showed a name she had not yet registered fully in her head: Patricia Winters. "Hannah," Patricia said, "we'd like you to come in again. Mr. Crawford has asked to speak further. There may be an opportunity for you within Vertex." The phrase, "an opportunity within Vertex," landed with a mix of disbelief and instinctive caution. Opportunities, in Hannah's ledger of life, had been few and required tending. The offer was not a gift. It felt, at least in the way Patricia described it, like a possibility with boundaries and bureaucratic scaffolding. Patricia laid out the shape without excess: interviews with HR, a review by legal, and a possible pilot role assisting Mr. Crawford alongside a community outreach position they were launching. Hannah's mind cataloged it like a parent making lists: benefits, hours, commute, the safe margins for Tyler's needs. "If it's a job," she said, because practical language steadied her, "what kind of role?" "We're looking at a position that would be twofold," Patricia said: executive assistance for Mr. Crawford and a liaison role with the foundation we're organizing. It would come with salary, benefits, and room for growth. It would be professional, not charity. Mr. Crawford insisted on that point. Those last words felt like a careful clarifying line. Not charity. Not a handout. Not a story that erased the power difference. A recognition of competence married to organizational need. A structure that might, if managed correctly, offer stability rather than humiliation. Hannah sat on the edge of the couch, fingers worrying the seam of the cushion. The decision felt both enormous and terrifyingly commonplace. Could she walk back into the world that had just expelled her? Could she accept the scrutiny that came from proximity to power, even with the shield of process? What would it say to Tyler, to Mrs. Patel, to the small economy of their lives? At home, Tyler was constructing his volcano with a seriousness that only 10-year-olds could muster. He invited her to see the papier-mâché crater. "Do you think it will erupt?" he asked. "If we add enough vinegar to the baking soda," she said, and found him focused and trusting and infinitely small in her arms. For a moment, the world condensed to the question of how to keep this. She accepted the interview. It was not an impulsive leap. It was a measured, hungry step toward stability. When Hannah told Mrs. Patel, the neighbor's chest hummed with pragmatic praise. "You must watch your boundaries," Mrs. Patel said. "Make sure you keep your own paperwork. Don't sign anything without showing me." There was a protective fierceness there that made Hannah smile. On the morning she returned to Vertex, the elevator rose with a different taste. This time, she had a plan: questions primed, expectations tempered, and a clear set of metrics she would demand: hours, reporting structure, oversight, and guarantees on Tyler's health coverage. Patricia met her in the corridor with a folder that looked like a peace offering with clarity. "We've set up a preliminary structure," Patricia said. "If you were to come on, your administrative reporting would be through me for day-to-day tasks. For foundation matters, there will be a board rep who you'll coordinate with. This is to avoid conflicts and provide transparency." Hannah read the phrase like a litany that would protect them both. She had expected vagueness. She found instead a map. That allowed her to breathe. She would not be a secret. She would have lines of accountability. The thought of structure comforted her like a good roof. The interview itself was thorough and oddly kind. Ben asked direct questions about her skills, about managing schedules, about how she handled stress. He seemed very interested in one thing beyond competence: how she made decisions when there were moral stakes involved. He wanted to know how she navigated the small ethical edges, the nub of who she was when no one watched. "You stayed with me in a rainstorm," he said, smiling with an almost embarrassed gratitude. "That took something from you." "It took a few minutes from a meeting," Hannah said. "It took a little of everything. I didn't think about the consequences, except for the person in front of me." Ben leaned forward with a careful intensity. "That's the kind of judgment we hope to build into the foundation we're launching, the practical judgment that comes from lived experience. People who have been in these situations can design programs that actually work." It was appealing. It was also, she reminded herself, still an interview. There were forms, references, and the slow, deliberate hum of legal review that kept everything honest. Patricia explained the compensation in concrete terms: salary, benefits that included Tyler's prescriptions, a relocation stipend if needed, and a probationary training period under Patricia's mentorship. Hannah noted each number as if it were a small miracle that had to be checked twice. "And," Patricia added, "we will require full disclosure if there's any personal relationship that develops. We will build the reporting lines so you never directly report to Mr. Crawford on foundation matters. There will be board oversight." That last line was the hinge. It addressed what she had feared more than the audition for a new title: the power imbalance. If anything bloomed between her and Ben, it would be witnessed, recorded, and managed with institutional safeguards. Hannah felt relieved by the guardrails. She would not be allowed the illusion that love could absolve structural risk. The meeting closed with more paperwork than either of them liked to sign. Hannah left with a tentative offer to begin with a pilot contract pending HR and legal review, a step that respected process rather than circumvented it. She knew enough to not celebrate in front of the world. An offer on paper could be revised. Still, the numbers in the spreadsheet began to shift, making certain inevitabilities slightly less sharp. She could see the inhaler refill move from debt to covered. Back at home, Tyler's volcano awaited. The simple domesticity of it, mixing baking soda with vinegar, capsizing glitter to simulate fire, reminded her that life was still comprised of small, essential miracles. She tucked Tyler into bed and watched him breathe, the rise and fall steadier than it had been on some restless nights. For a fragment of time, Hannah allowed herself to imagine a future where their landlord did not loom like a threat, and Tyler's asthma was manageable with a pharmacy card the size of a credit card. When she lay down that night, the city rain had finally moved on. She felt no certainty, only a fragile, steady pulse of possibility. The offer was not a handout. It was a demand for competence, paired with a rare recognition. Someone had seen an act of care, and, instead of exploiting it, had tried to structure it into work that would help others. Still, the world remained complicated. Richard's memo would circulate. Office gossip tended to mutate truth into rumor. Victoria Harrington, Ben's sharp and sometimes prescient ex-wife, had not yet entered the frame, but Hannah sensed that the world inside corporate glass had its own gravity. There were risks in vicinity to power: rumor, projection, and the slippery assumptions people like to make. The next morning, as Hannah looked at the tentative offer again, her phone buzzed with a message she did not expect. "Can we talk?" It was from an unknown number. Her stomach dropped and settled into a low, familiar pressure. She opened it and saw a name she did know now: Ben Crawford. His message was direct and uncomplicated. "I read your notes about the community programs. Would you be willing to expand on them tomorrow? I'd like your input on a pilot." There was no fanfare, no hint of an invitation to anything beyond work. Hannah stared at the screen for a long time. The decision she faced was the same one that had been in her chest since the curb: whether proximity to power could be navigated without losing the compass of who she was. She typed a quick, careful reply. Yes, I'll be there. She thought of the small things when she went to bed. Tyler's tentative smile at dinner, Mrs. Patel's steady help, the corner of the spreadsheet that now glowed with a new possibility. She thought also, with a readiness that felt fierce, of her own name. She had never wanted to be defined by circumstance. She had wanted, at least in the quiet places of her life, to be known for the choices she made. When morning came, the city looked like any other, a dozen lives advancing in parallel. Hannah steeled herself for the day by folding her hair back and putting on a blouse that felt like armor. At the door, she paused to kiss Tyler and watched him shrug on his backpack the way he always did, practiced and brave. At the curb, a taxi idled. The driver was a 20-something with a knotted baseball cap and the sympathetic patience of someone who knew the city's small tragedies intimately. As they climbed the glass tower, Hannah felt that old rush of vertigo, the elevator's upward hum mirroring a life that was moving to a place she had not anticipated. The city shrank outside the windows until the roads were little threads. She stepped into Ben's office again, the view of the skyline making the world look both vast and oddly intimate. He greeted her not like a savior nor like a benefactor, but like a colleague requesting counsel. They talked about the pilot program with a focus that belonged to people who wanted to make systems work. He asked questions about outreach, about childcare stipends, about measurable outcomes. At one point he said, almost conversationally, "We need people who've lived this to run this, not as charity, but as expertise." Hannah found herself explaining how bureaucracy sometimes trampled dignity, how a minimum wage goodwill program could do damage if it didn't listen to the people it claimed to help. She spoke about Tyler's school and about the small humiliations of lining up for food assistance. Ben listened without interrupting, and when Hannah finished, he said, quietly, "I want this to be designed by people with real experience, not consultants with white papers." The line between career and transformation was beginning to blur in a grounded, rational way. It was not miraculous. It was laborious and bureaucratic and mediated by forms and legal reviews. But the colonel, someone with power recognizing the expertise of lived experience and attempting to structure it into influence, felt like an honest, human possibility. Later that afternoon, as she walked back to the subway, Hannah felt something else shift. A cautious optimism, a professional hunger to see if policy could actually reflect humanity. She also felt the weight of being newly visible. The city was a mirror, and in it she saw herself at once humbled and ready. Then, as she turned the corner toward home, her phone vibrated with a text that made her heart stutter. A photograph from Patricia, an invite to a preliminary orientation meeting with the legal team, HR, and one board representative. The caption read, "We're making sure everything is above board." Hannah read the words twice. In the picture, the boardroom looked pristine and serious, a long table that promised process. She felt steadier for that small phrase, above board. It meant someone else would be looking, auditing decisions, arranging protections. She had not expected gratitude to feel so much like homework. She had not expected the first ripple of the life she had been moving toward to come hand in hand with more work, learning new systems, being trained, being inexperienced in a land where experience was demanded. It was exhausting. It was, for the first time in a long while, tethered to the possibility of something that might be more than survival. That night, Tyler put the finishing touches on his volcano, glue tacky with glitter. He looked up at her. "Do you think we can make a difference?" he asked, earnest, the simple gravity of a child asking the question adults often avoid. Hannah looked at him, his small, open face, and understood that the question had always been hers, too. "Yes," she said, because it felt like a vow. "We'll try." The next morning, she woke to a new kind of noise, an internal rustle of expectation. There would be interviews and training and probably gossip. There would also be structure, transparency, and the oversight she had demanded of herself and now of the company. She would not be a charity case, and she would not be a passenger in her own life. There would be negotiation and boundaries, and she had a schedule of questions in her mind that she intended to use. And then, at the exact moment she had finished a list only she would ever see, reporting lines, performance metrics, conflict of interest policy, her phone rang. The display lit up with a name she had unknowingly learned to recognize: Victoria Harrington. There was an audible intake of breath through her teeth, the kind you don't notice until it separates you from the moment. Victoria's name was not on any formal document she'd been given. It belonged more to whispers in the lobby and the offhand comment from a colleague. She's back in the city. Hannah's skin prickled at the sound of it. She answered, hands unexpectedly steady. "Hannah?" Victoria's voice was smooth, precise, part of it practiced like a blade. "I hear you met with Ben. Congratulations." "It was a meeting," Hannah said. "We discussed a pilot program." "That's excellent," Victoria replied. "Ben has always cared about outreach. I'd be delighted to introduce you to a few donors. We're organizing a gala next month. Full disclosure, it will be well attended by people who can actually fund this kind of initiative." Hannah felt the moment tilt and saw it for what it was: invitation and potential complication folded into one. The idea of donors and gala and a public stage was a useful ladder for the foundation. It was also territory where the rumor mill turned personal lines into headlines. "I'll consider it," Hannah said. She kept her voice steady and did not let it become small. "But I'm new to this. I'd like to see a clear plan first." Victoria laughed, a precise, polite sound. "Of course, you'll learn quickly. See you at the gala?" "Perhaps," Hannah said. When she hung up, the echo of Victoria's voice lingered. It was the first external nudge toward the complexity that romance and reputation would bring. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, the documents she needed to read spread out like a new language. She would be asked, in due course, to step into rooms she had never imagined: ballrooms lit for donors, conference calls with social service directors, strategy sessions where the phrase "measurable outcomes" was spoken like a prayer. The thought made her throat tight and her hands steady at the same time. If this story feels like the kind you want to follow, tap subscribe now and stay with Hannah through what comes next. Victoria Harrington arrived like a glossy rumor. Her return to the city had been mentioned by strangers in the lobby, then by a vendor who dropped off floral samples, and finally in a private email from Patricia with the subject line, "Victoria, potential donor conversation." The name carried a precision. Victoria was polished, well-connected, and practiced at turning social capital into funding. She also had history with Ben Crawford, visible at board dinners long before Hannah's umbrella had shielded a stranger on a rain-slicked curb. Their first in-person meeting at a pre-gala brunch was composed to feel innocuous, with avocado toast and stiff coffee. Hannah sat across from Victoria, feeling the polite geometry of the room as if it were a measuring instrument. Victoria's smile was exact. Her compliments were well calibrated, as if designed to put Hannah at ease and then locate the exact point that might wobble. "Your proposal has heart," Victoria said, speaking as if generosity were a practiced trade. "But you'll forgive me if I ask about scale. Donors want impact, not optics." Hannah appreciated the question. It was reasonable. "We're building pilot programs with clear KPIs," she replied. "Childcare stipends, emergency medical fund access, and an employment pipeline that trains and places single parents in stable roles. We'll track placement rates, retention at 6 months and a year, and family economic indicators. We expect to refine after the pilot." Victoria nodded. "And about your role, are you the face of the foundation, the public figure?" Patricia filled that gap before Hannah had to. Hannah will be lead for program design and community engagement. She'll work alongside our communications team. The foundation will have a board and an independent operations director to ensure oversight. The refrain of overseen and bored calmed something in Hannah. It meant the work was not a vanity project. It meant the company was attempting to build accountability into the space where private money could do public good. Still, rumors were their own weather system. Within a week of Victoria's public appearance, whispers started in the hallways, people speculating about what it meant that a woman from Ben's past was now at the same table where funds were being discussed. Diane's sympathetic glance shifted into a question Hannah could read. "Are you okay with this?" Hannah answered with a simple, "We'll follow policy," which read as composed and left the actual worry under the surface where it could be felt but not named. At the same time, the HR inquiry into Hannah's termination moved with the careful pace of corporate procedure. HR interviewed witnesses, reviewed timestamps, and spoke to the ambulance crew. They documented Richard Morrow's prior disciplinary history, a ledger of punctuality warnings that read like a man who worshipped the clock. The investigators found the firing technically in line with policy, but flagged that the context, where a single, unambiguous act of compassion directly led to a termination, warranted remedial action. The company couldn't simply sweep the matter under a compliance rug. Richard was placed on administrative reassignment while HR conducted a performance and leadership review. He was required to attend a management training program focused on equitable enforcement and implicit bias. The action was measured, not a dramatic fall from grace, but a recalibration that acknowledged his function without making him a villain. Hannah watched the memo land in the company channel, felt the small vindication of process, and realized that the system could sometimes correct itself, slowly, humanly, imperfectly. Work under Patricia was demanding and exacting. Patricia was generous with knowledge, stingy with sentiment. She put Hannah through a precise onboarding that included calendar management, executive briefings, and a crash course on corporate governance. They rehearsed how Hannah would introduce program metrics at donor meetings. They practiced answering tough questions, where the money would go and how the foundation would avoid paternalism. "You don't have to code switch into someone you're not," Patricia advised one evening as they worked late, the office lights thinning to amber. "But you do need to learn the language that opens doors in these rooms." Hannah appreciated the clarity. Learning to use that language felt like learning to read a map in a foreign city, one that would allow her to guide others through bureaucratic streets she'd navigated only by necessity before. There were small victories tucked into the long days. Tyler's inhaler was switched to a vertex-covered plan long enough for Hannah to breathe without calculating the refill on a napkin. The deposit for a modest condo was covered by a relocation stipend, allowing them to move into a place with brighter windows and fewer leaks. Tyler's school arranged for a nurse to meet them at the door during an asthma flare. These were practical tokens of stability, not magic, but real changes that stitched into the fabric of their life. And yet, the personal edges closed thicker with each public appearance Hannah made. When she spoke at a small community forum about dignity in work, a blog picked up a photograph and placed it in an article that implied intimacy between her and Ben. The headline's innuendo was thinly veiled, but it didn't need to be bold to be harmful. Proximity was enough to invite speculation. Hannah handled the first wave of gossip with the steadiness she'd learned from years of parenthood and low-wage labor. She did her job, answered questions honestly, and pointed to policy. "I'm an employee of the company," she said in one interview. "My work stands on measurable outcomes, not rumors." Patricia's PR team issued a statement about transparency and reporting lines. The board rep, Gerald Westridge, arranged a short meeting to reassure donors that proper governance was in place. Gerald was the kind of man who spoke in terms of systems. He met with Hannah in a quiet conference room, folding a napkin into a precise triangle. "We don't want anyone to feel like decisions are being made privately," he said. "We will have an independent audit of foundation grants, and you'll be able to present your program budgets directly to the board's committee." Hannah liked that he spoke of processes rather than personalities. It made her feel less like a rumor and more like a professional with a brief and a budget. Victoria, for all her polished veneer, planted questions that sometimes landed like jabs and sometimes like seeds. At one donor luncheon, she suggested a collaborative grant with an established nonprofit that had scale and reach. It will keep donors comfortable, she said. They like established names. Hannah heard the pragmatic merit in the idea, but pushed back gently. Scale is important, she said, but so is lived experience. Partnering is smart only if those partnerships allow the people we serve to lead, not be subsumed. The reply was measured, but it drew a thin line. Victoria's eyes narrowed fractionally, not in anger, but in assessment. The tension between being accepted into the upper circuits of philanthropy and retaining the integrity of the work tightened most when the gala preparations reached a fever pitch. The gala was a public launch, a night when donors would be courted, when the foundation would be presented with its mission, and when Hannah would stand at a podium and speak about the people she had been hired to serve. The stakes felt enormous. A successful evening would mean concrete funding and a chance to scale pilots. A misstep could turn the foundation into a PR story that did nothing for the families it sought to help. In the weeks of rehearsal, there were small, private moments that sketched out a more complicated relationship between Ben and Hannah. They shared many hours in the same room, at first in professional meetings, later in late-night strategy sessions where the office emptied and the city's lights refracted like 1,000 small eyes. Their conversations were often about substance. Metrics, outreach, legal language. But sometimes they were simply human. Ben would ask about Tyler's school routine. He noticed the way Hannah arranged a meeting agenda, prioritized voices in a room, and insisted on a line item that would cover bus passes for single parents attending training sessions. Those moments of recognition were mutual. Ben admired Hannah's instincts, the way she translated dignity into practical program design, the way she anticipated pitfalls that a spreadsheet couldn't capture. For Hannah, Ben's attention was a recognition she had rarely received without a layer of patronage. He listened and he acted. He also had to be careful, an ongoing, almost bureaucratic carefulness that could cool affection into procedure. It was Patricia who enforced the boundaries that would protect both Hannah's autonomy and the foundation's integrity. On the eve of the gala, she called Hannah into her office and slid a formal disclosure form across the desk. "We're asking staff to sign these," Patricia said. "They're standard. They include recusal from decisions where there might be a personal relationship." Hannah read the lines, language about disclosure, recusal, and an independent ethics review. It was unromantic paperwork, but Hannah felt grateful. It meant they were not improvising rules around feelings, they were establishing them. "I'll sign," she said, and it felt like signing for a promise to herself. Ben met her, later, in the service corridor behind the ballroom. The hum of the gala rose up through the walls, clinking glasses, rehearsed laughter, the murmur of small fortunes being negotiated over steak and salad. He looked worn in the face, in a way that made him human. "You look tired," he said. "You look tireder," Hannah teased, trying to keep the exchange small and ordinary. The joke landed, and they shared a brief laugh, a private, ordinary moment in a rare corridor of privacy. He was quiet then, and when he spoke, it was in a low voice that carried weight instead of heat. "I want you to know that everything we've done, asking for oversight, making reporting lines explicit, was because I respect your work. I don't want anything to shadow it." Hannah met his eyes. "I don't think anything can be done on the basis of secrecy," she said. "If something happens between us, it will be transparent. I can't be the story. I have to be the work." Ben nodded. "That's fair. If, and only if, anything were to develop, I will recuse myself from personnel decisions that relate to you. We'll put that in writing. You have my word." It was a simple, solemn compact. Not a romance-igniting pronouncement, but a set of breaks. Careful, consensual, and institutional. Hannah felt steadier for it. Power could be seductive. Safeguards could make it ethical. The gala itself unfurled like a film. Floral arrangements, banners hung with the foundation's new logo, a stage with a single podium, and the murmur of donors in evening dress. Tyler, decked in a small blazer that made him look like a miniature adult, watched from the mezzanine with Mrs. Patel and a volunteer who had brought along a stack of children's books for a small reading corner the foundation had funded for his school. Hannah's hands were steady, but her heart beat like a small drum. She had rehearsed the speech a dozen times. She wanted to be concise and precise. No overwrought pleas, no facile slogans. She wanted to give the donors something they rarely heard, the lived details of what dignity for a family looked like. When she walked onto the stage, the room focused as if a hand had reached out and rearranged it all. She looked at the faces, some familiar, some not, and found, in the front row, Ben's brace just visible beneath his trousers. He rose when she did and gave a small nod. They had agreed on this choreography. He would not be the stage's center, she would be. She spoke about waiting rooms and inhalers, about the simmering anxiety of small bills, and about the quiet calculus parents undertake each month to keep their children safe. She described the pilot programs, the measurable goals, and how the foundation's grants would be tightly bound to outcomes and led by groups with lived experience. Her remarks were practical, full of examples: the bus pass vouchers, a fund to cover co-pays for emergency medication, and the employment pipeline that would place participants in partner companies with onboarding and mentorship. She closed with a single story of a father she'd met in an intake session months earlier. A man who had lost a job and nearly lost his family stability, but had been given an apprenticeship that led to a trade job and a steady paycheck. Dignity looks like a monthly paycheck that actually covers rent, she said. It looks like a school nurse who knows a child's name. It looks like a parent being able to sleep at night. The applause was generous and real. Donors stood to commit funds. Victoria watched from the back with the professional face of someone who knew how to count outcomes and image in the same breath. Ben came up afterward, and they hugged in that manner that said, "We did it," without overstepping the institutional choreography. It was in the quieter moments, as the night drew down, that a different conversation happened. They walked outside, where the city air felt like a promise, cold and honest. Ben put his coat around Hannah against a breeze she hadn't expected. "You were magnificent," he said. "You made them see what we already believed in." Hannah felt an ache that was not purely relief. "You helped too," she said. "You started the conversation." He looked at her then, in the way that made the world contract into the two of them. "There's something I need to say," he began, voice careful. Hannah held up a hand to stop the romantic momentum from tripping over the rules they'd agreed to. "We agreed about transparency," she reminded him gently. "I know," he said. "I want to be transparent. I also want to say what I feel is not a shortcut. It didn't start because of the gala or PR. It started because you have integrity that makes me want to be better." He paused. "But we'll do this right. Board disclosure, written recusal. I will not be involved in decisions that affect your compensation or role. Those are the boundaries. If you want to explore what this might be outside corporate responsibilities, if you wanted that, that would be with full disclosure and only if you wanted it." Hannah inhaled. This was the adult way of speaking about something that could easily become story fodder. It was kind, intentional, and painfully rational. "I don't want my work to be treated as a pet project," she said. "If this is personal, we own it publicly and we put safeguards in place. And we move slowly, professional stability first." Ben nodded. Agreed. They did not rush into a romance that night. There was instead the quiet of two people setting terms. Later, walking back into the ballroom to gather Tyler, who'd been coaxed onto a small stage for a children's reading, Hannah realized that the slow, careful ethics they'd negotiated were themselves a form of intimacy, a trust built on boundaries rather than secrecy. In the months that followed, the foundation launched its pilot. Grants were awarded through a committee that included community representatives and an independent auditor. Patricia moved into the role of operations director, overseeing day-to-day management, while Gerald and the board took a hands-on approach to early decisions. Hannah served as director of programs, implementing the pilots she had outlined. Her salary and benefits handled the essential fixes to their life: stable rent, a health plan that made medication affordable, and savings for emergencies. These were not miraculous reversals, but pragmatic improvements that let Hannah and Tyler breathe in the same room without calculating every inhale. Richard's reassignment became a slow lesson in management. He completed the leadership training, was given a new role that emphasized structure rather than punitive enforcement, and over time adapted a bit. He remained human in the narrative, someone who had built his identity on procedure and found, begrudgingly, that rules could bend when human cost demanded it. Victoria continued to operate in the donor circles. Occasionally, her posture veered into the territorial. There was a tense moment when she suggested replacing a community partner with a larger nonprofit for reasons she framed as logistics. Hannah defended the smaller organization, citing their established trust in the neighborhood. Victoria listened, then offered a compromise, a phased partnership, where the smaller group would lead the pilot and the larger nonprofit would support scaling only after demonstrated impact. It was a negotiation that kept the smaller group's dignity intact while offering Victoria the structure she craved. The compromise showed Victoria as pragmatic rather than purely antagonistic, still wary of risk, but capable of aligning with Hannah's values when outcomes required nuance. Ben and Hannah's relationship developed under the lantern of transparency. They dated, slowly, with public disclosures in board minutes and a formal recusal appended to personnel documents. Ben recused himself from managerial decisions affecting Hannah. An independent committee reviewed any raises or promotions that touched her. They arranged a cadence of check-ins with HR to ensure boundaries were respected. When the tabloids tried to invent a scandal, the foundation's public statement, detailing processes and reaffirming the board's oversight, neutralized most of the fire. The measured approach gave their romance a rare ballast. It was not unchecked, secret, or salacious. It was deliberate and accountable. There were tender, small domestic changes as well. In the mornings, Ben would sometimes drop Tyler at school if a meeting allowed. He became a familiar presence at the parent-teacher nights and, over time, a comfortable figure in Tyler's life. He did not try to replace Hannah's role as parent. Instead, he offered logistics and a patient warmth that Tyler responded to with reasonable teenage reserve, leaning toward affection. One Saturday, the family, Hannah, Tyler, Ben, Mrs. Patel, stood around a kitchen table dusted with flour, making pizza the way Hannah used to: thin crust, a messy topology of toppings. Tyler, flour on his nose, grinned as Ben showed him how to twirl a small sphere of dough. It was ordinary and unscripted. For Hannah, it meant stability and a kind of quiet joy that had nothing to do with headlines. The foundation's first impact report came 6 months after the gala. The pilot showed promising signs: a 70% retention rate for job placements at the 3-month mark, bus pass usage up by 90% among participants, and a measurable reduction in missed workdays tied to childcare support. Stories filled the report: a woman who had been able to return to work because of a childcare stipend, a single father who, with a small emergency grant, kept his apartment after a sudden medical bill. Numbers and names braided together to show a living effect. At the annual shareholder and donor meeting, Hannah presented the report. She stood before a room of executives and community partners and told the story of each data point with a human voice, never reducing people to metrics, but not shy of them either. The foundation secured additional funding to expand the pilot to 3 new neighborhoods. Donors committed to multi-year support. The board praised the rigor of the audit, and the committees congratulated the team for building accountability into the foundation. Ben watched from the sidelines as Hannah spoke, pride visible but not overbearing. After the meeting, when the applause had cooled and the room was thinning, he caught Hannah by the elbow and led her into a quiet hallway lined with plants. "You've taken something messy and made it honest," he said. "You made it real." She leaned into him for a moment, a small human softness. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was a team, and it was a lot of work." The work continued. They tightened policies, reviewed grants, and made sure the voices of those they were serving were at the table. There were nights when Hannah still lay awake thinking of spreadsheets and families, but the terror that had once gnawed at her, would there be rent, had been traded for the precise labor of trying to change systems. Over time, the public narrative shifted. Instead of stale innuendo, stories focused on the foundation's outcomes. Parents found it easier to return to work. Children had school nurses who could respond to asthma flares. Local nonprofits were invited to co-design programs rather than be replaced by bigger names. The modest, measured approach yielded real results. The romance between Hannah and Ben evolved into a steady companionship. They navigated the awkwardness of power differentials with repeated care. They used HR check-ins, they never let meetings veer into private hires, and they always disclosed any potential conflict to the board. The structure did not kill tenderness. It protected it. When they finally decided to make their relationship known publicly, they did so with a joint statement that emphasized their commitment to the Foundation's mission and the safeguards they'd established. The epilogue of their public life came not with a headline about romance, but with a modest, powerful picture. Tyler at a school assembly receiving recognition for a class science project, his volcano model crowned with papier-mâché glory, and Hannah and Ben sitting side by side, hands barely touching. The photograph that circulated was a simple one: ordinary people in a genuine family moment. Readers responded with comments about the Foundation's impact, questions about how to replicate the model in other cities, and thanks from parents who'd seen their lives shift. A year from the rain-slick morning where Hannah had made a single, instinctive choice, their life was quieter in the way of settled things. Hannah's title had evolved to Director of Programs and Community Engagement. Patricia had become Operations Director, a role that fit her precise competence. Richard still worked in a unit where structure was central. He'd become, slowly, less punitive and more procedural. The Foundation had launched an online toolkit for other employers interested in replicating their pilot, and Vertex expanded their community partnerships to 3 additional cities. One evening, in the small condo with brighter windows, Tyler spread glitter across a volcano platform. He narrated his science process to Ben as if the man were an expert, and Ben listened with a patience that made Hannah smile from the kitchen doorway. The dinner table was a collage of papers: Tyler's homework, a list of Foundation metrics, a grocery list Mrs. Patel had scrawled, and the ordinary chaos made the house feel like a home. Ben chopped vegetables, humming along to a radio station they both pretended to dislike but secretly liked. "You're doing it," he said to Hannah, a comment that tasted like both gratitude and admiration. Hannah set the pizza in the oven and watched the orange glow bloom. "We're doing it," she corrected, because it was never only her work. It was threaded through neighbors, a patient executive assistant, donors who insisted on accountability, and a board that listened. Most importantly, it was a network of people whose dignity had been restored in small but vital ways. After dinner, Tyler asked if Ben would help him test the volcano with the dramatic ovation he had promised. They spilled into the living room with a tray of baking soda and vinegar. Ben knelt and showed Tyler the exact ratio to produce a satisfying eruption, and when the concoction fizzed and overflowed into the cardboard crater, Tyler screamed with that delighted, unembarrassed joy that made both adults around him laugh. Hannah sat back on the couch, watching the two of them. The scene was mundane and sacred at once. A family stitched together from a single act of kindness, careful governance, and the long labor of building something better. She remembered the rain, the cold, and the briefcase spread like a small storm on the curb. The consequences of compassion had been complicated. There had been a firing, an investigation, a long series of approvals. There had been gossip and policy meetings and hard conversations about power. There had also been transformation, a program that kept families afloat, a stable home, and a careful love that chose transparency over secrecy. When the house settled to a hush, Ben sat beside her on the couch. He reached for her hand and kissed it, a gentle press that contained years of unspoken understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Hannah asked. "For trusting process, and for making sure the next person doesn't fall through the same cracks." Hannah looked toward the small, sleepy form in the next room, the boy whose inhaler once lived in a cereal box. She felt the weight of the ordinary miracle they had carved out of the world. It was not a fairy tale reversal. It was a series of careful, human decisions, policy and love braided together. They had built safeguards so that power could be used to protect, not to exploit. The foundation they launched continued to refine its work under audit and community oversight. Donations funded bus passes, emergency grants, and training stipends. Families told their stories at community meetings that Hannah hosted. Donors, often moved to tears, learned to value lived experience over glossy reports. A final detail lingered on the kitchen table, a small thank you note from a mother named Rosa, thanking Hannah for the childcare stipend that had allowed her to return to a job and keep her daughter in daycare. Hannah read the note, folded it carefully, and placed it in a small box labeled "Good Reasons." It was not grand. It was everything. Outside, in a city that still wore its rain as punctuation, life went on. Policies were debated and revised. Board meetings went late. The rumor mill occasionally spat out a spark that was quickly smothered by transparency and facts. Hannah continued to balance schedules, to refine programs, and to insist on dignity as an operational principle. There were hard days, budget shortfalls, staff turnover, a crisis at a partner nonprofit. But the work had momentum. The foundation was not a magic wand. It was a tool. Months later, at a small neighborhood center, Hannah watched a line of parents pick up emergency grants that meant the difference between heat being shut off and a warm home. A mother cried and hugged her. "You changed my life," she said. Hannah thought of the man on the curb, of how a choice made in a rainstorm had threaded into policy and then into a life saved from a drift into crisis. She thought of Tyler's volcano, of the nights she'd been exhausted but held on, and of the bureaucracy that had finally learned, at least once, to bend toward mercy. She smiled, and on the street a delivery bike rattled by, harmless this time, and she felt, in that ordinary moment, the measure of what had changed. Not wealth, not fantasy, but work. Careful, measured, accountable work that could, imperceptibly, improve a life. If this story moved you, like and subscribe, and tell us below. Have you ever helped a stranger and it changed your life? Share your story.